Good afternoon. This is Anna Mongait. Today I have with me an acclaimed academic, historian, and expert on LGBT rights and homophobia in Russia, Dan Healy. Hi, Dan.
Hello.
Russia's government becomes more totalitarian by the day. It started the war in Ukraine. Is there some kind of relationship between totalitarianism and militarism and LGBT rights?
Traditionally, yes. I think there has been a linkage between forms of totalitarianism, especially in the 20th century, and forms of hostility to LGBT people. Part of that has been about militarization and the nature of producing a military society, a society willing to go to war. And that has traditionally been the job of men. And so a particular kind of heterosexual masculinity has been something that totalitarian regimes have tended to insist upon. And so we saw that, for example, under Stalin in the 1930s. He recriminalized homosexuality for the entire Soviet Union in 1933-34, partially to strengthen the martial sort of spirit of Soviet men, but also because there was a fear of conspiracy, of closed groups of men gathering together in secret, concealed, working against the state. In a similar way, Hitler in Germany strengthened the laws against homosexuality that already existed when he came to power. In 1935, he intensified the law against homosexuality and put something like 50,000 men into concentration camps for their homosexuality in Nazi Germany just in 12 years.
You've studied the evolution of homophobia in Russia, from Stalin to, like you say in your book, Sochi. And right now, two famous Russian athletes, a tennis player, Daria Kasatkina, who's a star of Russian tennis, and the footballer Nadezhda Karpova, came out, having left Russia. But it's pretty clear that within Russia, almost no one rich and famous has ever come out, because they want to remain rich and famous, obviously, and maybe they prefer to focus on their personal instead of moral principles. What do you make of this very Russian phenomenon of people knowing how to maintain a certain lifestyle while withholding the truth both from themselves and the public? In this Russian context, how effective is coming out as a tool against homophobia by changing the way people think? Because, for example, Daria Kasatkina's coming out made a big impression on people.
A problem here about deciding what the right strategy is. And for many countries, being visible, being public about one's homosexuality or one's gender difference has been a way to liberalize society, to educate society about the range of different kinds of queer people there are out there, and to educate family and friends as well in that process. It's not even popular everywhere you might think in the European Union. I mean, plenty of countries in the European Union are also have societies where people are nervous about coming out. Italy. Spain, not so much anymore, but Italy is like a classic example. Greece as well. It's popular in the big cities, sure, but beyond one or two big cities, it's less and less likely. Some of our scholarship about LGBT society in Russia reveals that, in fact, the closet is a safer space. Not coming out makes you safer in Russia. And some people live safer lives as a result of that. So we have to reckon with that. We have to understand that and appreciate that. The other thing I would say is that famous people and wealthy people and important politicians and so on have traditionally, certainly in Soviet times, not spoken about their private lives very much. Russian society wasn't used to that kind of openness about private life. And there is I think, until very recently at least, a sense that those things are private and should not be brought into the public realm at all. The people who are coming out now, I think, are being very brave and are challenging that sense of what is appropriate to bring into the public sphere. And I think that's part of being a younger generation and of refusing to compromise, actually, about who they are. And so that's a change not just for LGBT people, but it's a change for wider society as well. And it would liberate wider society too, if more noteworthy people spoke about their private lives, about their family situations, about who their wife is, for example, and about who their children are more explicitly. That would be more transparent, and it would be helpful to society as well. But it's not for me to tell Russians what to do.
But we lived through the 90s, the freest and most open period, with an incredibly quick revolution that led to global societal changes. And it felt like the changes really were global. In this environment, too, which was suddenly completely liberated. A lot of gay clubs opened, people started to dress how they wanted, rebellion was almost welcomed to a point, and it felt like that was the only direction anything could go.
Yes, I mean, this is a classic in Russian history. I think that evolution has to come with a big bang, with a big sort of rupture or a big change. And certainly the 90s were that period of a big change. I lived in Moscow in 1995 and 96 for a year, working on the research for my first book on the history of homosexuality in Tsarist and Soviet Russia. And I witnessed some of those changes, the new nightclubs, the new openness, the public face of an LGBT community that was actually organizing and had national organizations and was developing a free press, which of course in those days was hard copy newspapers and magazines and journals, books. It was developing libraries and archives of materials, self-help organizations, and so on. There's so much activity. It was really very impressive. And even though much of that is now gone, it has left its mark. It's left its mark on society. It changed society by educating more people about LGBT life and producing new generations of people who want something different, who want something better.
I don't know if you've heard about this, but there was this tragic story recently where in some rural gay club, a drag queen came out with an LGBT flag. They were singing the Russian national anthem, right, which led to a fine, a citation, and they made them publicly apologize right on camera. You could see some people in uniform there. It was absolutely terrible. And it seems like it reflects how society here is changing. These people still exist, but they can't even sing Russia's national anthem.
I'm particularly saddened by that case because it happened in Yekaterinburg, which is one of my favorite Russian cities, and one of Russia's most liberal cities, most civilized cities in many respects. And so it's very sad that it has happened there. This is the pernicious effect of the gay propaganda law, and also, I think, the new kind of totalitarianism that has started since the 24th of February, where it's very difficult to criticize, or virtually impossible to criticize the state and its actions outside of the very narrow sort of pathways that have been laid down by the media in Russia since the 24th of February.
The war has magnified this huge difference that exists between Ukraine and Russia, even on this topic. We were all struck by the fact that in Ukraine, there was a petition that was not only raised but taken into consideration on potential LGBT marriages or at least civil partnerships. And it wasn't thrown in trash right away. On the contrary, it was decided to consider the matter further, and in theory, a positive verdict might not be too far away. It would be legalized at the judicial level. How do you think that happened? That two neighboring states with a shared imperial history have gone into such diametrically opposed directions on this?
It's a very interesting question about the geopolitics of LGBT policy around the former Soviet Union, more generally. I think since 2013, since the first gay propaganda law, what Russia has tried to do is propose to the near abroad, to its pro-Russian partners in various political ecologies of these different republics, that a gay propaganda law would work for you too, in Kazakhstan, in Kyrgyzstan, in Ukraine, and Georgia, and so on and so on. And those laws didn't really take very well in most cases. In most cases, the receiving society decided, maybe we'll just put this to one side for a while, because we're getting pressure from the West as well and from the international community who don't like this. Or perhaps we want to bid for the Olympics, and this is the case, I think, with Kazakhstan. They put their proposed gay propaganda law aside for that reason. So this has already been part of Russia's soft power in the near abroad. It's not surprising that when these two societies, these two states that have been so closely entwined for such a long time and now find themselves on opposite sides of an argument in such intensive circumstances, that this is going to be one of the issues that's dragged in and used by both sides. And let's remember that President Putin, on the 24th of February in his speech, hinted at supposed attempts by the West to impose LGBT values on Russia. That was there in his speech on the 24th of February about the war. So the gauntlet had been thrown down already by Russia, and it's not surprising at all that LGBT activists in Ukraine and President Zelensky have picked it up. And I think it's so interesting that Ukraine is showing a pathway to perhaps a different kind of masculinity that, or patriotism that allows for... Yeah. It is paradoxical, but we live in the 21st century, not the 20th.
Not we, but you.
Well, possibly that's true. But it is paradoxical. But all tactics are fair in war, it seems. And it's very interesting that President Zelensky decided to pick this up and run with it and take it seriously. And I think it means that he is taking the LGBT population of Ukraine seriously. And they, in turn, are making their contribution to the war effort there.
So you touched on the completely different attitudes towards gay people on the different territories of the former Soviet Union. There's as many countries as there are stances. Everyone seems to be different. But Russia itself, also this imperial monster, so to speak, is made up of many different groups and people. There's Chechnya, where it doesn't get much for gay rights. There's places like Moscow, which are full of modern, contemporary thinking no matter what. What can you say about how the country is positioned in this way? How are attitudes towards LGBT people and homophobic sentiments aligned and distributed in this country, if you exclude Chechnya here, which is another darker matter altogether?
It's a really interesting question. and more research needs to be done. That would be the classic academic response. But it is a really important question to investigate, because of course Russia is made up of many different peoples and many different cultures and societies. I'm very aware from some of the work I've done with asylum seekers coming from the Russian Federation to Western countries when they are not from the Russian ethnic group, that sometimes there's an extra layer of homophobia there that comes from the particular ethnic group. Of course, Chechnya, but also perhaps Buryat Mongolia and other nationalities in the Russian Federation. For some LGBT citizens in those regions, it can have an extra layer of difficulty because of the demands of local tradition. And those local traditions, I think, are held on to that much more strongly because of the pressure that Russian nationalism puts on those peoples. And so it's a complex layering of different kinds of homophobia, some of it coming from religion, some of it coming from all kind of official sort of folkloric culture about your particular people within the Russian Federation. And of course, the militarization as well, which creates a demand for a particular kind of traditional masculinity.
Можно ли сказать, что в революционные времена...
Could you say that in the revolutionary times of the 80s and 90s and the 1910s and 1920s before that, that is when attitudes towards LGBT people and homophobia change?
ЛГБТ-людьми меняется, и с гомофобией меняется.
And these breakthrough moments happened before the 80s and 90s too in Russia, right?
годы, которые мы видели в России.
Well, it's a mistake, I think, to think that LGBT people and liberation didn't come to Russia only in 1980 or 1991. In fact, in the 1917 revolution, part of the agenda was to decriminalize the Tsarist law about sodomy. We have some images here that are, some of them date from that time period and show us that there was quite a lively queer culture in Tsarist Russia, in the big cities particularly, and that there was some growing understanding of it. There was part of the socialist movement in Europe understood that the laws against homosexuality were wrong, and they criticized them, and they said, you know, the day after the revolution, we'll get rid of those laws. And strangely enough, Lenin and the Bolsheviks were part of that movement and adopted the same agenda. So
they weren't homophobic?
They were well, look, they didn't have a strong understanding of...
They had other issues to deal with.
of the lives of homosexuals and gender variant people, not at all. That really wasn't very well embedded in the socialist movement, even in Western Europe. But what they did do was, I mean, they had a checklist, right, of things they were going to do. And, you know, votes for women, yes. Women in the public sphere, yes. Get rid of superstition and religious language in the law. So they got rid of not just prohibition on sodomy, muzholostvo, but they also got rid of the prohibition on incest, krovosmeshenie, and they modernized the language of the criminal code so that it sounded more like the language that police used and that criminologists used in the 1920s. So rather strangely, from the first Soviet criminal code of 1922 right until 1933, when Stalin returns to this law, for a period of that 11 years or so, there is no anti-gay law in Soviet Russia and in the other Soviet republics, except for some of the Central Asian and Caucasian republics. And the Bolshevik position is unclear, you could say. They disagree with the idea of having a law on sodomy, at least for the European parts of the Soviet Union. But they're not too crazy about public displays of homosexuality either. And sometimes they prosecute those as hooliganism. but they also cultivate that leftist movement of sexual reform that's very busy in Weimar Germany at this time in the 1920s, promoting a public role for LGBT citizens in Germany. And they have links to Magnus Hirschfeld, who is the big liberator of LGBT people in Weimar Germany in the 1920s. Nikolai Semashko, the first Commissar of Public Health of Russia, goes to Berlin and visits Hirschfeld in 1923, and Hirschfeld shows him a film he made in 1919 about the situation of homosexuals in Germany. And Semashko's quite impressed by it and says, we don't have this problem because we've got rid of the law. So he appreciates it. And in fact, he brings back copies of that film. And the reason we know about that film today is because copies of it survived in Soviet archives.
Почему?
So why did it happen then, this restriction of LGBT rights? And is it possible to draw connections to the restrictions of LGBT rights that is happening now?
Well, of course, Stalin in the early 1930s is trying to consolidate his power and trying to mold society in very specific directions. And he's caused a lot of chaos in the process. Collectivization, the five-year plans and crash industrialization. The cities are, 10 million people move into the cities between 1928 and 1932. They're absolutely bursting at the seams. So there's a lot of social chaos, and now in the second five-year plan, we have to kind of clamp down on this, organize society better, and make these new factories start to produce properly. So there's those considerations, but there's also the worsening international situation. So Stalin is very aware that geopolitically the Soviet Union's quite vulnerable. It's the only socialist country in the world, and everyone wants to invade it, everyone wants to strike at it, at least in his mind. And the way that the law against homosexuality, male homosexuality, comes about in 1933-34 is that Ginrich Jagoda reports to him that there have been arrests of large numbers of male homosexuals in Leningrad and in Moscow, hundreds of men. He wants to prosecute them, but he doesn't have a law against homosexuality. And Stalin says, well, we have to have one. Примерно наказать этих мерзавцев. That's what he said. And Kaganovich and others agree wholeheartedly, and Stalin edits the law himself, and in fact adds longer sentences. So even for just consensual voluntary sodomy between two adults, he insists that at least 3 years is the minimum sentence. And the significance of that is that those people would be sent to the worst parts of the gulag. Because a 3-year sentence meant you got sent to the lageria, not to the kolonii, which were closer to population centers. So you were sent to the far north, the far east, the worst places for being convicted of this crime.
Are there any statistics for all the years that this appalling law has existed on how many people it has affected and how many have been imprisoned?
We don't have complete figures, but we know for about 45 of the 60 years or so of the operation of this law, we can say at least 38,000 men. 38,000 men were convicted under this law and spent time in colonies or in prisons as a result. And we have large gaps, large runs of years from 1933 until about 1950 or 53, where we don't know the number at all. Various LGBT historians have tried to work through the archives to find these statistics, and they're very difficult to find. The crime statistics generally are very fragmented in post-Soviet archives. And so we may never know the exact number. I would estimate something like 50 or 60,000 is actually the real number of victims of this particular law.
What situation did the people you were just talking about find themselves in? Thousands of whom were sent to the Gulag under that very article, in, as you said, the most difficult camps, the most difficult conditions.
I wrote something about this in the book about Russian homophobia, From Stalin to Sochi. So, but that isn't yet available in Russian. I hope one day it will be. So the position of those people was very difficult. Already in the 1930s, there was a strong homophobic culture inside the camps and inside prisons that the Stalin Gulag inherited from the Tsarist prison system. That already existed in the 19th century, a hostility toward the homosexual, usually using words much worse than homosexual, of course, in places of confinement. And those men were sometimes treated as prostitutes, they were raped, they were humiliated, they were given the worst jobs, the worst food, forced to clean toilets.
Those who were sent there under this article immediately had to face those conditions,
because they would be very visible as someone with that mark. You are somebody who has been convicted under that. Because the first question when you arrive in the cell was, you know, why are you here? What article are you here under? And it was something you had to recite as well whenever there was a count of prisoners. So everyone knew publicly what everyone else was convicted for. Of course, in the Gulag as well, there were weaker prisoners who were raped by other men and put into the same category, the same class of humiliated people, opuszczone. And they were treated in the same way. So in fact, the sort of victims of homophobia within the Gulag is much larger than just this 50,000 or 60,000 people who went through the system.
In your opinion, as far as this incredibly developed and entrenched culture of homophobia in prison, in a country with such a high number of prisons and prison camps, and therefore such a large number of people who have passed through their prison system, how has this affected society as a whole?
An argument I make in my book is that it's very influential on wider society. 18 million people, at least, passed through the Gulag during Stalin's time. And something like 85% of those people survived and went back to society. So these are people who saw a very visible and very violent homosexual culture in the camps and the colonies. And they carried that knowledge back to their families, back to society. And I think that that was one of the most important things shaping homophobic attitudes in the late Soviet Union. We don't have any studies about homophobia in the Soviet army, but we can imagine, because it was also a single-sex institution where people were held in confinement and where Dedovshchina was really part of everybody's experience, that there was a homosexual element to that that was brutal and that also created yet more homophobia. But there are no academic studies of the homosexual element of Dedovshchina.
This is very interesting. And I would be terribly curious to know if you think it's possible to continue the study of this now very much outlawed topic in modern Russia like you do. How is your work structured? You've traveled all over the place, studied this subject in different parts of the country. How do you go about your work now?
Well, it's very difficult, of course, now for Western researchers to go to Russia. I'm aware of Russian citizens who are continuing to do research in Russian archives because we've only scratched the surface of what is possible to find. in terms of LGBT history, positive and negative, in the Russian archives and in post-Soviet archives more generally. What has generally been the case is that academics in Russia have denied that this is a legitimate topic of research and have denied that there's anything in the archives that will reveal anything about LGBT communities in the past in Russia, partially out of some odd patriotism. It's not happening here. Comrade, look for situations where LGBT people naturally gravitate or emerge. One place in the Gulag is actually the Kavicha, the cultural vospitательные части of the camps. There were certainly a large number of LGBT people in those entertainment sections and cultural sections of the camps. For example, Vadim Kozin, the big singer, who spent 5 years in Magadan from 1945 to 1950, partially on sodomy charges. He spent most of his time, he was fortunate, he spent most of his time actually working in the Magadan Musical Dramatic Theater.
Public theater?
A public theater that was built by the big bosses of the local Gulag camp. And like many other theaters in the Gulag, they picked out the best actors, the best ballerinas, the best opera stars, the best singers, etc., and the best directors, and put them together in these surf theaters, basically, and had them performing for NKVD officers, for their families, and for prisoners as well.
So, if I understood you correctly, you said you haven't been to Russia since 2014.
That's right, yes, not since 2014.
Why not?
Какая причина?
What's the reason for not coming?
My husband won't let me go.
Боится. Ваша безопасность.
He's afraid for my safety, and I have to admit I'm not very confident in my safety if I were to go to Russia as well. I had some hope that I might go this year to do some library research and to see friends and so forth, but after the 24th of February, it's obviously impossible. Well, maybe one day I will go back to Russia. I want to see Solovki, see more of the Volga River. I've been fortunate to travel on the Trans-Siberian Express. Haven't just been to Magadan. And I adore the country, actually. I'm still in love with the country, even though it treats me so badly.
I'm with you. I hope that I will be able to return to Russia someday, too. Thank you very much. That was Dan Healy, someone who, in many ways, knows a lot more about our country than we do. At least on this now completely taboo topic of the history of homophobia and queer people in Russia and the USSR. Thank you.
Спасибо вам.